Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. This episode is about the Kavanaugh-Ford spectacle, and it's about bad ideas, psychological science, and believing brains. And after having watched the hearings and after having been horrified by the amount of certainty on both sides in this case, I felt compelled to make this vlog. I've been working in the fields of hypnosis and neurolinguistic programming for the past 21 years, done a lot of research into memory and deception and nonverbal communication. And what's really clear to me, based upon having watched this, is that our legal systems are fundamentally anti-psychological, meaning that the map that lawyers and judges and the people involved in the legal system use of human psychology is seriously outdated. And just as bad, most people are pretty psychologically illiterate, so to speak, meaning that many of the conceptions they have about memory and deception and how beliefs are formed are based upon very flawed assumptions. So when we get people who have a lot of certainty, and where the certainty is largely based upon premises that have proven to not be the case, then that's a problem. So the first thing I notice is that people on both sides, people who think that Kavanaugh is guilty and people who think that Ford is speaking the truth and vice versa, I notice the amount of certainty, the absolute certainty that so many people have in their belief. And I notice this certainty with politicians, with journalists, with public intellectuals. And if you ask people, what do you base your beliefs and certainty on? The answer you will usually get is that people base it upon investigating and using reason and logic and evidence to form their beliefs, that their beliefs are basically the result of using evidence, reason, and logic. People largely believe this. Here's the problem. The psychological science very strongly suggests that it mostly works the other way, that the brain is a belief engine of sorts, that we essentially start by believing. And that after having formed a belief really quickly, we then use our intelligence, we then use our reasoning skills, we use our logic as a press secretary, as a good lawyer, to create a narrative that supports what we already believe. So in this case, one thing that's really scary is to notice that as soon as you know what someone believes in the Ford-Kavanaugh case, you can way more often than not infer their political position, meaning are they Republican or are they Democrat? There's been several polls done on this, which shows a really strong correlation that you can way more often than not predict people's political position based upon who they believe and what they believe. So this is a red flag. This is a huge red flag. So there's been quite a bit of research on, for example, mock trials that show that in a trial, people don't objectively gather evidence and then use reason and logic to evaluate the evidence and then land on a position of guilt or innocence. That's not how the human mind seems to work. The legal system often thinks that it works that way. The people who work in that system often thinks that it works that way. And most of the population think that it works that way. If you ask people, why do you vote this politically, or why do you vote that? Most people will say, at least the ones who view themselves as somewhat sophisticated and independently minded, that they have used reason and logic and evidence to land at their current position. But during these mock trials, what instead happens is that people very quickly decide on guilt or innocence. And then during the rest of the trial, their reason and logic creates a narrative to justify and to make a watertight case for what they already believe. And if you watch in this particular case, notice the amount of certainty and notice how quickly people reach their conclusions. And also, when you notice people referencing their own feelings as if their feelings tell them who's speaking the truth. This is, again, a lot of people think that they are really good at seeing who's lying or who's telling the truth. A lot of people will say that they read other people like open books. But when tested in the lab, most of us end up somewhere around 54%. This also includes police officers, it includes judges, it includes lawyers, it includes psychologists, psychiatrists. So many of these experts have a privileged position in the legal system because we collectively believe that they have this special skill in terms of detecting deception. But in actuality, when there's not that much proof on either side, they're essentially tossing a coin, and they're very likely to vote their temperament, so to speak. And so no matter how strong your feelings are, they're not telling you anything about either Ford or Kavanaugh or who's speaking the truth or who may be innocent. There's no information in your feelings to tell you anything about that. That's the strength and the intensity of your feeling and your conviction tells you nothing about truth or guilt of a crime in the world, but it tells you about the level of internal coherence that you have in terms of creating a story that seems plausible in your own mind. That's what the intensity of your feelings are telling you about. So in this particular case, there are several options, meaning Ford may be telling the truth and Kavanaugh may be lying. Ford may be misremembering, meaning that someone may have attempted to rape her, but it wasn't in fact Kavanaugh. And there's a possibility that she may sincerely think that it's Kavanaugh and that it wasn't Kavanaugh. This is actually possible. It's also possible that this never occurred, that it's a false memory, but that she believes that it occurred. And it's also possible that it never occurred and she made the whole thing up, and that she knows that she made the entire thing up. I have to say that I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. So I'm not making any claims about truth in terms of the case. But the claim that I am making is that no matter which of these positions you may have landed on based upon the hearings, there's no reason for you to really trust your feelings, no matter how intense they are, as some sort of truth barometer. Now, one idea that might be worth challenging is the idea that the United States Supreme Court is primarily looking for an upstanding citizen who's impartial and wise and has a lot of equanimity and is fair-minded. I mean, it's I found some quotes here. This is an interesting one. This is a quote from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence properly reached. Say it again. This is from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Mere factual innocence is no reason not to carry out a death sentence properly reached. Here's another one. Evidence of innocence is irrelevant. This is from Virginia Attorney General Mary Sue Terry. This is a good one. This is from U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Entertaining claims of actual innocence would have a very disruptive effect on the need for finality in death penalty cases. Here's a slightly more optimistic one. The execution of a person who can show that he is innocent comes perilously close to simple murder. This is from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackman. So, I mean, if Kavanaugh is guilty, and I'm not saying that he is, but if he is, and he is the sexual predator that he gets painted to be, well, it might be the case that he's actually in good company then, in having a total disregard for human life and the rights and the innocence of other people. But here's something I want you to seriously consider. There's a really bad idea that has gotten a lot of momentum, and that is the idea that women should be believed. That it's time for us to believe women, and that a woman who accuses a man of rape or violence is somehow entitled to be believed. This is a really bad idea. It's a really bad idea, not because she's a woman, but because she's a human being. It would be an equally bad idea if I said believe men, or automatically believe men just because they're men. Because if you're going to say believe women, or that a woman has a right to be believed, you're also simultaneously implying that the person who is accused should automatically be disqualified from any credibility due to his gender. Now, is this a world that you want to live in? Imagine it was you, if you're a man, or imagine that it's your son, or your father, or your brother. Do you really want to live in a world where the burden of proof is on the accused to prove his innocence? In Western philosophy, there is a maxim of innocent until proven guilty. In rule of law and due process, there is this notion that it is up to the accuser to prove his or her case. Now, if you're going to reverse the rule of law and due process, this is extremely problematic. It's going to make all of us less safe. Men, women, children, all of us. Now, some people have made the case that, but this is a job interview. It's not a court case. Therefore, rule of law and due process and that type of stuff isn't really that relevant. I disagree. I strongly disagree. And the reason I strongly disagree is because the psychological research points in the direction of the human mind being a belief engine. That we have a tendency, as I said previously, to believe first and to use reason and evidence later, while simultaneously thinking that we largely do the opposite, meaning that how we are ideally supposed to work in the justice system and how the human mind seems to actually work, that gap is huge. That gap is huge. Therefore, we should set the bar high. We should set the bar high also, even if it's not a court case, to nudge ourselves both individually and collectively to attempt to come a bit closer to that ideal in actuality, even if we know that the human tendency is not actually to operate that way. But I think we have a responsibility both individually and collectively to do our best to attempt to get that way. So if you're going to believe first or believe the woman, then you're setting the bar in such a way that you're actually reinforcing the natural tendencies we have, where the brain is a belief engine, where confirmation bias works in full swing, and as a result, we will all be a lot less safe. Now, some people have said that, look, there's no reason to not believe Dr. Ford or anyone who comes with these allegations, because no one would ruin their own lives or ruin someone else's life, you know, if it wasn't truth to it. Like, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's a lot of reason to be very skeptical of this claim. And I'm not talking specifically about Dr. Ford here necessarily. I'm talking about the human mind in general. So, for example, even people I respect a lot, like the neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris, landed on the position that the idea that a person like Dr. Ford could misremember or kind of mix up who actually raped her was essentially a non-argument. And this is not the case. It's just not factually true. There are many documented cases of people who have been raped and who later have picked out the wrong person to be the rapist, and who have been 100% sure that they picked up the right person. If you want to really look into it, there's a marvelous book called Picking Cotton. It's written by Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. In 1984, a woman by the name of Jennifer Thompson was raped in her apartment by a guy who broke in, and she was able to get a really good look at his face. And during the rape, she actually told herself, remember this face, like burn this face into her mind, because she wanted to remember him so that she could later pick him out. And she ended up picking out a guy, to make a long story short, she ended up picking out a guy by the name of Ronald Cotton, and she was 100% sure that Ronald Cotton was her rapist, 100% sure. And Ronald Cotton spent 11 years in jail as an innocent man as a result of this, until he was able to, after 11 years, get a DNA test and prove that he was not the rapist. There was a guy named Bobby Poole who was the actual rapist that DNA evidence actually showed. But the really interesting thing is that when Jennifer Thompson saw Bobby Poole, who was her actual rapist, she was 100% sure that it wasn't him. And when she saw Ronald Cotton, who was not her rapist, she was 100% sure that it was him. Now, the really cool part about this story in the book is that Cotton and Thompson have become very close friends. They've written the book, and they've done a lot of lectures around false memory and witness testimony and stuff like that. But there are quite a few cases like this. I remember reading about one case where a woman had watched a psychologist on TV talk about the fallibility of memory. And then someone broke into her apartment and raped her, and she ended up identifying the psychologist on TV as her rapist, and completely believing in that story. Another case was a woman who identified a guy as her rapist, and it proved that she had seen this guy before, but this was the guy who used to sell her train tickets at her morning commute a couple of years earlier. And her brain had somehow attached that face to the rapist's body and picked him out and was 100% certain. Now, notice this. I'm not claiming that this is the case in the whole Kavanaugh-Ford spectacle. I'm just saying that if you have reached certainty in yourself that this just couldn't happen, then you're scientifically wrong. These things do happen. Now, should we automatically trust women when it comes to, I mean, they should be heard, as men should be too. If they have a similar complaint, they should be heard, but no one should be entitled to be believed. During the late 80s and early 90s, there was an epidemic in parts of the Western world, especially the United States, but this was also a huge issue in Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, and several other European countries. It was the whole recovered memory therapy scandal, which was an epidemic. And I'd highly recommend the book The Repressed Memory Epidemic by Mark Pendergrast if you want to like really have an in-depth look at it. He's one of the best writers on the topic. He estimates that during the heyday, early 90s, there was about 1 million people a year approximately who recovered memories in therapy of sexual abuse that never happened. There's a guy called Christopher Barden, who's a psychologist, lawyer, who was able to bring down the MPD, the multiple personality disorder therapists and the recovered memory therapists. He was able to like essentially bring down those industries in the mid-90s through a multidisciplinary route with these huge lawsuits in the mid-90s. And he estimates that there were several 100,000 people in the United States alone who ended up recovering memories of sexual abuse that never happened as part of a therapeutic process. Now, many of these clients were women, and many families were torn apart. You know, relationships between siblings, parents, families torn apart. Unfortunately, there has also been a lot of convictions, people who have innocently been sent to jail as sexual predators where there's no evidence that they've done anything wrong, and where the only evidence has been recovered memories based upon recovered memory therapy. This is less likely to happen today, but it was a huge problem. Now, many of the worst offenders, meaning of the therapists who help people recover these memories, were well-intentioned. I mean, they believed in what they were doing. They had some combination of like new Freudian ideas with some radical feminist ideology and some postmodernism thrown in, and ideas of repressed memory, and the idea that people needed to recover the memories to become well again. And many of the worst offenders were psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, and many of these were women, and many of the people who made the claims were women. There are even instances of people being convicted for murder based upon these testimonies. You have the famous Eileen Franklin case, who in therapy started recovering memories of having seen her father kill this young girl who was killed many, many years before. And based upon this and the sworn testimony of the psychologist that this was something credible, the father, George Franklin, was sentenced to life in prison. He was released later because his daughter started remembering other murders in therapy that he couldn't possibly have committed, and there was nothing else tying him to the case. So if you add the satanic ritual abuse scandals of the 80s, the daycare hysteria cases, stuff like that, unfortunately, even though it's no longer an epidemic, the notions of repressed memory is still very much alive with many professionals and in the public and in Hollywood and in media. You can watch the Netflix documentary series The Keepers, for example, and you'll see a lot of reference to this nonsense. You can take a look at the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and just how many therapists who have reviewed that book as really, really good, and he's spouting this nonsense about dissociation and body memories and recovered memories. So these ideas are still alive and well. So these things are possible, and in this particular case, the Dr. Ford case, I'm not saying that they apply there, but we don't really know. We don't really know what has happened during these therapy sessions that she has been a part of. Now, if you want to ask, for example, with misremembering and false memory, like, why are these notions so attractive to people? Like how could anyone send their father or their brother or an innocent person to jail for a crime? Well, many of them generally believed in the memories, and it's psychologically often a very attractive theory, because if your life isn't working that well and you suffer a lot internally, it can be very attractive to be told that, look, you're not responsible for this. This is due to something someone else has done to you, a trauma that's repressed, and as a result of that, your life has kind of not turned out as well as you had hoped, and you get the identity of a survivor, and that type of stuff. This can be very, very attractive. Now, there's a final possibility as well, and again, I'm not saying that this is the case either, but it is possible that Dr. Ford is making this up and knows that she's making it up, and that Kavanaugh is, in fact, innocent. Again, not saying that this is the case. I don't know. I'm saying that it could be the case. And when people say, no, that's just, completely irrational, a woman would never do that. She would never do that to a man. She would never ruin her own life or ruin his life. Like, she has no incentive to be doing it. All the incentives are on Kavanaugh to be lying. That is true. Kavanaugh has, if he's guilty, has a lot of incentive to lie. So that's beyond. But so does a person in Dr. Ford's position too. I mean, I think it's extremely naive to say that she would have no incentive for doing so. First of all, the hatred towards Trump, especially on the political left, is enormous. Dr. Ford is, in all likelihood, on the left politically. She's at Palo Alto University, which is kind of as I've read and understood, a a place where social activism is regarded to be more important than science, where radical feminism and kind of postmodern ideology has a strong foothold. So the consequences of a conservative judge, as Kavanaugh, in the Supreme Court for decades, is enormous. So if Ford could be the person who could sabotage that nomination, she would become a hero for life. She already is to a lot of people. She'd be a hero for radical feminists, for a lot of people on the political left, for a lot of survivors. Her standing in academia would be secure. So from like a status, social position, career, identity perspective, there's tons of incentive to be doing something like that. Not to mention, the book deals and the movies that may be produced and all of this type of stuff. And of course, I also read that back in 1996, Dr. Ford's parents lost her home in this foreclosure thing, and that the judge presiding in the case was Kavanaugh's mother. Again, I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily the case. I'm just saying that it's possible. It's possible. The idea that no woman would deliberately hurt a man or deliberately ruin someone's life in that way is just not true. Some women, some of the time, are very much willing to do so. And if we take a step back from the politically correct society that we're living in at the moment, if you have a beer or two with a police officer who's worked those kind of cases, he or she will be able to tell you about plenty of false rape allegations. There are people who do this. There are women who cynically invent and know that they are inventing charges of rape against men who are completely innocent. In the same way that there are sexual predators out there who are men who are deliberately hurting women who are lying about it and who are willing to do so. There also are women who deliberately do these types of things. Now, I don't know how many they are, but they exist. And they may have many different motives for doing so. One example, if you read up on evolutionary psychology, you could look at the books of Douglas Kenrick, for example, as a source for this. It said that somewhere between 3 and 10% of kids grow up thinking that a guy who's not actually their biological father is their biological father. Between 3 and 10%. That's a pretty solid number. Now, a lot of these women have to know that they are deliberately lying and deliberately showing a complete disregard of someone else's basic human rights, meaning it's a complete disregard to the man who's being lied to, who's being told that he is the biological father of a child who isn't actually his. It's a crime towards her own kid, who gets sold a lie that a man who's not the father is the father, and of course it's a crime as well against or should be at least, against the person who actually is the father, who does not get a chance to get to know his son or daughter, and the son and daughter don't get the chance to know. I mean, this is, in my eyes, as bad as a rape, or perhaps even worse. And there are people who are willing to do these things. who knows? There's a lot at stake in this Kavanaugh-Ford thing. It's a case that is a lot bigger than the both of them. And the argument I'm making is that the feelings that you have when you sit and watch the hearings do not tell you much about Ford or Kavanaugh. It's I don't know what happened. You don't decide to, like, there's no Pinocchio sign for deception. You don't determine guilt or innocence by body language or by how aggressive someone is or whether you like them. You know, you have to do it by really investigating the case, like really investigating the case and seeing where you can find evidence and where you cannot find evidence and what corroborates the story and what does not corroborate the story, essentially. So those are my reflections on the topic. It is also interesting when you look at the whole Me Too movement and the spectacle, which, you know, probably has done quite a bit of good on the one hand, but there's, you know, if you look back at the whole repressed memory thing of the 80s and 90s, it's not true that women haven't been heard, you know, in general. I mean, it's not really accurate. Anyways, my meeting's a ramble. I hope this was useful. I hope this may help you to kind of challenge your certainty bias a little bit. If you want to look into this more, the books I mentioned, Picking Cotton is a really good one. The Repressed Memory Epidemic by Mark Pendergrast is a really good book. There's a book called Unfair by a guy called Adam Benferrato about the legal system, which is really good around this stuff. And there's a book called The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer. That's also a pretty good source to look into. And what seems clear to me also is that in the Me Too movement, there's a big tribal element here, meaning when several people, for example, came forward claiming that Bill Clinton had sexually assaulted and raped them. And again, I don't know if Bill Clinton is guilty. But there's an author, the late Christopher Hitchens, who wrote a book called No One Left to Lie To about the Clintons, where he made a pretty compelling case. These women talk about the mainstream media having no interest in listening to them whatsoever. And in this case, you have a conservative judge, and suddenly this is huge. Now, I have to state my own biases. I'm not psyched about a person who has an invisible friend and who wants to prohibit abortion and who supports the death penalty and who wants enormous powers for the president. I mean, I don't live in the States, so I don't really have a bone in the fight, so to speak, but I don't share those political preferences. Mine are more libertarian. But with the Me Too movement too, I mean, if you look at many feminists and how they tend to respond when people inform them about the oppression of women in Muslim majority societies, or even in pockets, ghettos in societies in Western cultures, they have a tendency to ignore it and to brand the person who's informing them as a racist or a fascist. So there is something about that movement that seems very, very tribal, and I think it's worth challenging many of the premises. So anyways, hope this provoked some new thinking. Till next time.